A Gift of Opal. The winter after Grace stood before the Fairy Queen was the quietest she could remember. Not in a lonely way, but in the way of a house that has been set right, after a long disorder, where the silence has a different quality entirely. Something restful and earned. She tended her garden in the spring, walked her hills with her hickory crutch, and gathered what the forest offered with the same careful gratitude she had always brought to the work. Dewberry visited when the evenings were warm, and the two of them would sit by the creek and speak of nothing of importance, which is the surest sign that a friendship has grown fully into itself. It was the spring of 1906 when Grace met David Westmoreland, and the meeting was not remarkable in its particulars, only in what came after. He had come to her door with a bushel of late apples from his father's orchard, sent by the elder Westmoreland as a gesture of neighborly goodwill to a woman living alone on the hill. His father farmed a good piece of bottomland 3 miles east along the creek road, and David was the middle of his 3 sons, which is a position in a family that produces a certain kind of person, patient, accustomed to negotiating between the needs of others, not given to putting himself first in line for anything. He was perhaps a year older than Grace, with hands that showed honest work and a way of holding his hat when he spoke to someone that suggested he'd been raised to mean what he said. He didn't stare at her crutch, and he didn't pretend it wasn't there, and Grace, who had lived long enough to understand that those were the only 2 bad choices most people made on that subject, noted his easy manner and thought well of it. He asked if she needed anything split before winter, because the question was practical and he was a practical man, and she said she'd be grateful for it, because she was a practical woman, and that was the beginning. He came back in October to split wood, and then again in November with a jar of his mother's preserves. And by December they were talking the way 2 people talk when they've decided, without quite saying so, that the other person is worth the effort of honesty. He told her about growing up as the middle Westmoreland boy, with an older brother who was bold and a younger one who was charming, and how he'd learned early that steady work was its own kind of standing. She told him about her mother and father, and about the years of managing alone, and about the arithmetic of a life built on careful knowledge and stubborn will. She didn't tell him everything, because not everything needed to be told at once, but what she told him was true, and he received it the way a good field receives rain, without waste. They were married in April of 1907, on a mild Saturday with redbuds blooming along the creek road, in a small ceremony with his family and 2 neighbors standing witness. Grace wore a dress the color of creek water in summer, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers she'd gathered herself that morning, because she knew where they grew and what they meant, and that knowledge was, as always, a comfort and a pleasure both. It was midsummer before she took David to the limestone shelf, where Little Sugar Creek ran cold beneath the overhanging rock, and called for Dewberry in the old way, which was simply to sit quietly and wait, because Dewberry had always known when Grace was near. The fairy appeared between one breath and the next, the way she always did, her lace wings catching the afternoon light, her small face carrying the magical expression of a creature who is curious but reserving judgment. David sat, very still. Grace had told him enough that he wasn't entirely unprepared, but there is no real preparation for the first sight of a fairy, and he was quiet for a long moment, looking at Dewberry with an expression that was something between wonder and the careful attention a man brings to anything he wants to understand properly. Dewberry hovered at eye level with him and studied his face the way she sometimes studied the surface of the creek, reading what moved beneath it. "He's all right," Dewberry said at last, in the tone she used when she meant considerably more than all right. "There's no cruelty in him anywhere. I'd know it if there were, the way you'd know a bitter root from a sweet one, and there's none." She landed on Grace's knee and smoothed one of her wings with a businesslike air that Grace recognized as Dewberry's way of being pleased without making a show of it. David let out a slow breath, and then he smiled, and the smile was the same one Grace had been watching all spring and summer, the one that started in his eyes before it reached anything else. He told Dewberry he was honored, and he meant it plainly, which was the only way to mean anything in that special place by that oh-so-familiar creek. They made a good life on the hill above Little Sugar Creek, the 3 of them, which is to say Grace and David and the hickory crutch, though David was careful never to make the crutch feel like a problem he was solving, because it wasn't. and Grace appreciated that he understood the distinction. He brought energy to the farm that she hadn't had alone, and she brought knowledge to the land that he hadn't had without her. And between the two kinds of knowing, they grew more than either of them had managed separately. In the third year of their marriage, on a morning in late September when the oaks along the creek were just beginning to think about turning, Grace gave birth to a daughter. And the birth was long and difficult the way real things often are. But the child arrived sound and strong, with a voice that announced her presence, as if she'd been waiting impatiently for exactly this moment. They named her Opal, because Grace had always loved the way that word felt, something old and luminous and containing many colors at once, and because David said it suited her before he'd even seen her eyes, which turned out to be true. Dewberry came that same evening, and she didn't come alone. Grace had never seen so many fairies gathered in one place outside the Queen's cave, and she lay in her bed with Opal on her chest and watched the windowsill shimmer with a dozen small lights, and then the corner of the room, and then the doorframe, until the whole cabin seemed lit from within by something that had nothing to do with lamplight. Dewberry landed on the edge of the bed where Grace rested. Weary but happy, Grace rested under a worn quilt and held the auburn-haired Opal in her arms. The fairy said nothing for a long time, and the gathered lights held still, and the baby slept with the absolute confidence of someone who has never yet had cause to doubt the world. Then, Dewberry looked at Grace, and at David standing beside her, and she made the small sound that among fairies means a blessing offered freely, no ceremony required. The lights brightened for just a moment and then began, one by one, to drift back toward the dark and the creek and the quiet hills, until only Dewberry remained, sitting on the old bed and keeping her own kind of watch. Grace held her daughter and listened to the creek and thought about her mother and father, and about the long solitary years, and about the particular shape a life takes when it's built from patience and knowledge and plain stubbornness, and then kept building, past what you thought was the end of the plans, into something wider and warmer than you'd known to hope for. David's hand was on her shoulder. The cabin was full of light and breathing. Outside, Little Sugar Creek ran cold and faithful over the smooth limestone, the way it had always run, the way it would run long after all of them were gone, carrying everything gently forward.